The title of my paper is Visible Sign of a Hidden Presence, Postmissionary Messianic Judaism and the Healing of the Twofold People of God. First, some comments about post-supersessionist ecclesiology. This year is the 20th anniversary of the publication of my book, Postmissionary Messianic Judaism, which in the rest of this presentation I will refer to by the initials PMJ to distinguish it from the concrete reality of post-missionary Messianic Judaism as a way of life. It's also the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Council. Admittedly, the two commemorations are of unequal significance, but there is a connection between them. As I state at the beginning of PMJ, the book is not primarily about Messianic Judaism. Instead, it is a book about the Christian church and its relationship to the Jewish people. It is about ecclesiology and supersessionism. The volume asks the following question: how can a church which confesses a Nicene Christology and which identifies with the people of God in the Hebrew Scriptures re-envision her ecclesiology so that it is no longer supersessionist? On the same page of PMJ, I offer this definition of supersessionism. Supersessionism teaches that the ecclesia replaces the Jewish people as the elect community in covenant with God, in whom the divine presence resides and through whom the divine purpose is realized in the world. Non-supersessionists who renounce or qualify their Nicene Christology are not troubled by the question which drives the argument of PMJ. The Jewish people have the Torah, and the church has Christ. Each party has its own separate path to God, and the two paths are of equal efficacy. And no single community may rightly claim to be the people of God, in whom the divine presence resides and through whom the divine purpose is realized in the world. The Christology of Nicaea thereby neutralized, along, of course, with the covenantal claims of Sinai, supersessionism dissolves. But so does the Christian confession, which bound Christians for 17 centuries. In PMJ, I address the question of a Nicene post-supersessionist ecclesiology by positing an ecclesiology that is also an Israelology. This ecclesiology assumes that the entrenched perception of Judaism and Christianity as two separate religions practiced by two separate communities is in part an optical illusion and in part an all too real self-inflicted wound. The underlying reality, visible to us now only as an eschatological challenge and hope, is that of a single but twofold people of God. this internally differentiated people is constituted by a parachoretic union, a union of parachoresis, of mutual indwelling, in which the Jewish people dwells hidden within the church and the church within the Jewish people. Post-missionary Messianic Jews serve as the visible sign and witness to this ecclesiology, which is also an Israelology. They also present the Christian church with a test case revealing the extent to which she has come to terms with the truth of her own identity. While my 2005 book may not primarily be about post-missionary Messianic Judaism, the present paper cannot make the same claim. My task here is indeed to speak about this form of life and to explain why I consider it not only legitimate, but an essential component of a post-supersessionist Nicene ecclesiology. I will begin by summarizing PMJ's definition of post-missionary Messianic Judaism. I will then trace the historical connections binding post-missionary Messianic Judaism to Hebrew Christianity and missionary forms of Messianic Judaism, examining the latter phenomena with an eye to strengths as well as weaknesses. From there, I will return again to the question of ecclesiology, which we've just been reflecting upon, unpacking what PMJ means by bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel, and the role it assigns to post-missionary Messianic Jews. I will conclude by reflecting upon the vocation of post-missionary Messianic Jews as a call to radical solidarity with both the Jewish people and the church. So, first of all, defining post-missionary Messianic Judaism. In PMJ, I describe Messianic Jews as Jews who believe that Yeshua of Nazareth is Israel's Messiah and who also believe that faith in Yeshua establishes rather than undermines their Jewish identity. For all who employ the self-designation of Messianic Jew, Jesus and Jewish identity are mutually reinforcing rather than contradictory. Those calling themselves Messianic Jews include not only participants in the Messianic Jewish movement, but a host of Jews in churches for whom the term is interchangeable with Jewish Christian. The category of Messianic Judaism both narrows and widens the field of reference. Those who see themselves as practitioners of Messianic Judaism generally adhere to the Jewish rather than the Christian festal calendar and honor Shabbat rather than the Lord's Day. They treat the Pentateuch as the enduring constitution of the Jewish people. They are only a minority subset of those who call themselves today Messianic Jews, and thus the narrowing of the field of reference. However, the large numbers of Gentile Christians drawn to some form of Torah observance dramatically expands the field of those who view themselves, if not as Messianic Jews, yet as practitioners of Messianic Judaism. Post-missionary Messianic Judaism is a species of Messianic Judaism. In PMJ, I delineate three of its distinguishing characteristics. First, post-missionary Messianic Judaism, this is a quote, summons Messianic Jews to live an observant Jewish life as an act of covenant fidelity rather than missionary expediency. On the one hand, the emphasis on Messianic Jews and covenant fidelity distances post-missionary Messianic Judaism from the Gentile Christian Torah movement. The covenant in question is not a universal gift available to all who would choose to receive it, but the distinctive bond uniting the Jewish people to God. On the other hand, the contrast with missionary expediency distinguishes post-missionary Messianic Jewish practice from forms of Jewish observance adopted as pragmatic, tactical steps advancing an evangelistic strategy. Post-missionary Messianic Jewish practice is undertaken as a durable responsibility inherent in participation in Israel's covenant with God, not a piece of clothing donned for a particular occasion and discarded when a different occasion warrants. Second, post-missionary Messianic Judaism embraces the Jewish people and its religious tradition and discovers God and Messiah in the midst of Israel. Messianic Jews with this orientation, and I'm still quoting from the book, discern the hidden sanctifying reality of Yeshua residing at the center of Jewish life and religious tradition. They see their inner mission as the call to be a visible sign of this hidden messianic presence. End of quote. While it appears second in my list of distinguishing characteristics, this, in fact, is the most important feature of post-missionary Messianic Judaism. It has also been the most controversial, at least within the Messianic Jewish movement. The paradoxical claim that Jesus is already present at the center of Jewish life and religious tradition explains how this Jewish form of faith can treat Jewish tradition as authoritative despite that tradition's hostility to his name. Moreover, post-missionary Messianic Judaism asserts that the already existing presence of Jesus among the Jewish people is sanctifying. The Messiah imparts to Israel his own holiness. If Jesus imparts holiness to Jews, then he must also make available to them his saving power. This negates any missionary project towards Jews, whose aim is to make available to Jews a salvation that's currently unavailable in Jewish life. The soteriological implications of PMJ were not openly stated in that volume, but they were not lost on its readers. The book was plainly incompatible with any soteriological dualism in which the saving presence of Jesus was available to Christians and absent from the life of the Jewish people. In the years immediately following the book's publication, and in response to its controversial claims, theological discussion within the Messianic Jewish movement focused not on ecclesiology, but upon the issue of salvation. But the contention of PMJ was not simply that the saving presence of Jesus was accessible through Jewish life. Implicitly, the message was that he was at least as intimate a presence among the Jewish people as he was in the church. Explicitly, the message was that the church's culpability for its historical treatment of Jews and the Jewish way of life was weightier than any Jewish culpability for their historical response to Jesus. Yet, just as Jesus resided unrecognized in the heart of Israel, so Israel maintained its hidden presence in the heart of the church. In the Messiah, the twofold people of God, wounded by animosity and division, maintained a hidden communion. Post-missionary Messianic Jews visibly express this hidden reality by living as much as possible within the orbit of the Jewish world, integrating their faith in Jesus with their loyalty to their fellow Jews and their fidelity to traditional Jewish forms of religious practice. The third distinguishing characteristic of post-missionary Messianic Judaism concerns relationship to the Gentile Christian church. Quote, post-missionary Messianic Judaism serves the church by linking it to the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, thereby confirming its identity as a multinational extension of the people of Israel. End of quote. Since the rejection of Marcionism, the church has received the scriptures of the Jewish people as her own and has seen in biblical Israel a paradigm of her own relationship with God and her own mission in the world. A supersessionist ecclesiology rendered this embrace of Israel's scriptures theoretically compatible with hostility to Jews and the Jewish way of life, since the church was now the true Israel, and the old Israel had been cast off. Thus, when Jews were baptized, they left the old Israel and joined the new, improved version. It was only reasonable to expect them to surrender their old loyalties and renounce their former way of life. However, once the church recognizes supersessionism as a theological error, the traditional framework collapses. How can Gentile Christians read the scriptures of Israel as their own once they realize that these texts emerged from the life of the Jewish people, have been carried in the bosom of the Jewish people through all centuries since, and as the apostle asserts in Romans chapter 3, belong specifically to them And how can Gentile Christians not see these same scriptures as having a special bearing on the life of baptized Jews, summoning these Jewish disciples of Jesus to covenantal responsibilities other than those imposed on baptized Gentiles? According to PMJ, post-missionary Messianic Jews are the missing link that makes a post-supersessionist, non-Marcionite, Nicene ecclesiology possible. By establishing communion with post-missionary Messianic Jews, ideally Eucharistic communion in the Lord's Supper, the Christian church enters into explicit fellowship with members of the people of Israel who are living faithful Jewish lives. There is now concrete substance to the church's claim to be an extension of Israel among the nations. She can see herself in Israel's scriptures without viewing herself as a new Israel. The point here is not that Christian relationship with post-missionary Messianic Jews is a substitute for serious engagement with the wider Jewish community. Post-missionary Messianic Jews are not the true Jews or the good Jews. Post-missionary Messianic Jews are representatives, not substitutes. Connection to them should serve as an invitation to wider engagement with the Jewish people, to whom post-missionary Messianic Jews themselves owe their loyalty, and from whom they receive their way of life. But communion at the Lord's table, which is explicit fellowship in the Messiah, is not now possible with the wider Jewish community, among whom Jesus is indeed present, but by God's providential design, unrecognized. The representative function of post-missionary Messianic Jews in relation to the Gentile Christian church also implies the legitimacy of the church. Just as post-missionary Messianic Jews are not the true Jews, so they are not the true church. They, or we, are but a sign that the church is incomplete apart from the Jewish people, and the Jewish people incomplete apart from the church. To summarize, post-missionary Messianic Judaism, 1, involves Torah observance as a covenantal responsibility. 2, discerns Jesus' hidden presence, hidden sanctifying and saving presence in the midst of the Jewish people and religious tradition. And 3, represents but does not replace the Jewish people in relationship to the Gentile Christian church in the context of liturgical communion, enabling the church to identify as an extension of and not replacement for Israel's mission in the world. Now, to move on to the relationship of post-missionary Messianic Judaism to its antecedent movements, Messianic Judaism and Hebrew Christianity, and the missions movement. These 3 characteristics of post-missionary Messianic Judaism, distinguish it from other forms of Messianic Judaism. This distinction becomes especially important when Roman Catholics and members of the historic churches of the Reformation consider Messianic Judaism. Christians from these traditions often sense the problematic nature of the evangelistic mission to the Jews. And this is nowhere more the case than in Europe and in countries directly touched by the Shoah. I share this sense, and I react viscerally to forms of Messianic Judaism influenced by the dualist soteriology and individualistic ecclesiology common to the North American evangelical world. But my reactions are tempered by my perspective on the history of this movement and by convictions concerning the role of divine providence in that history. In the next to last chapter of PMJ, I survey this historical terrain, arguing that the 19th and 20th century Christian missionary impulse in relation to the Jewish people carried within it the seeds of an eventual post-missionary posture. Such a perspective enables those of us who are critical of the missionary enterprise in relationship to the Jewish people to reflect soberly and yet charitably on a historical phenomenon with which we disagree. In that chapter of PMJ, I note that the birth of Hebrew Christianity is indissolubly connected to the missionary movement of the early 19th century. Moreover, these two intertwined movements are inexplicable apart from the development of more positive Christian assessments of aspects of Judaism and the Jewish vocation in the modern era. In the pre-modern period, Christians treated Jews much like they treated heretics, Muslims, pagans, and adherents of other religions. Jews held erroneous beliefs and observed religious practices prohibited within the church. When they were baptized, Jews were expected to set aside all aspects of their identity and way of life as Jews. They were no longer to consider themselves members of the Jewish people in any sense. This changed in the 19th century, both in the Protestant and in the Catholic worlds. The emergence of missionary organizations aimed specifically at converting Jews to Christianity expressed, ironically, a new consciousness of the unique character of the Jewish people. Not just as those who allegedly killed their Messiah, but as those who were destined for good things at the end of the age. This new consciousness became manifest among the converts themselves through a radical departure from all past church practice since Nicaea. These baptized Jews, or Hebrews, as they called themselves in accordance with 19th century usage, banded together for mutual support, forming Hebrew Christian associations. This was unheard of. In this way, they claimed implicitly that baptism had not nullified their identity as members of the Hebrew nation. When the Zionist movement began in the late 19th century, Protestant Hebrew Christians further manifested their sense of national identity by supporting it and even seeking membership within it. While 19th century Hebrew Christians saw themselves as part of the Hebrew nation, they did not see themselves as practicing Judaism. In the modern era, it first became possible to distinguish Jewish nationality and religion. And the Hebrew Christians took full advantage of this novel distinction. While they remained Hebrews in their own eyes, members of the nation, they saw their religion as Christianity. They followed the Christian rather than the Jewish calendar and believed that the law of Moses was no longer in effect. This stark line between Hebrew religion and nationality was challenged at the end of the 19th century. Joseph Rabinowitz was the first to advocate the programmatic introduction of Jewish religious customs into the Hebrew Christian way of life, and the first to attempt to establish a Hebrew Christian congregation independent of outside denominational control. Rabbi Isaac Lichtenstein in Hungary at the same time, early in the 20th century, went further, continuing to live an Orthodox Jewish life and even refusing church baptism to preserve his right to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. More such figures emerged in the early decades of the 20th century. And the term Messianic Judaism was coined by them as a form of self-designation. The term actually emerged in the early 20th century, not at the end of the 20th century. Many of these early Messianic Jews continued to hold a dualist soteriology in which Jews who failed to confess faith in Jesus in this life were cut off from God's saving power. And many of them still engaged in some form of missionary activity. But their attitude to traditional Jewish religious practice had taken a striking new turn. These original Messianic Jews were a small minority within the Hebrew Christian movement of the first 7 decades of the 20th century. But their day came in the 1970s when a wave of young Jews in North America, Europe, and Israel came to believe in Jesus. These young Jewish followers of Jesus were not satisfied with denominational Christian life and instead opted to establish their own congregations, meet on the Jewish Sabbath rather than on Sunday, order their lives according to the Jewish rather than the Christian calendar of holidays, and yet use Hebrew as a language of worship. They no longer called themselves Christian, but preferred the term Messianic Jew, championed unsuccessfully decades earlier. However, like their early 20th century antecedents, most retained a dualist soteriology and a missionary mentality. The old Hebrew Christian establishment eventually moderated its criticism of the new Messianic Jewish movement and even adopted much of its language and symbolism. For them, Messianic Jew became a term interchangeable with Jewish Christian, and participation in a Messianic Jewish congregation was deemed at least valid, if not desirable. But no more valid and probably less desirable than membership in a Baptist or Pentecostal church. For the majority of those involved in the Messianic Jewish movement, worshiping as a Jew, on the other hand, was essential and not optional. For the Jewish Christians, it was only one possible alternative. But all were united in their missionary posture in relation to the Jewish world. Post-missionary Messianic Judaism originated in the late 1990s among a small group of leaders within the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. The book PMJ was the result, not the source, of this new direction. Post-missionary Messianic Judaism is still a minority faction of the wider Messianic Jewish movement. But it is no longer marginal, and ideas found in PMJ appear in many circles which have no direct connection to me or my colleagues. For Hebrew Christians of the past, involvement in the missionary enterprise served to underline the importance of the Jewish people in history and to make Jewish identity a central part of their daily lives. It had this positive function. From my perspective, it was always problematic, but it did transform how baptized Jews construed their continuing relationship with the Jewish people, that there was such a continuing relationship. Whatever the incongruities, these Hebrew Christians saw themselves as an integral part of the nation. The birth of the Messianic Jewish movement in the 1970s led Jewish believers in Jesus to an even greater measure of identification with the Jewish people and its way of life. Torah observance and even practices deriving from rabbinic tradition were suddenly live options. Many within the movement sought active involvement in the wider Jewish community and sincerely supported Jewish causes, even while holding theological convictions which portrayed other Jews as unsaved targets for missionary outreach. Post-missionary Messianic Judaism would not exist apart from the Messianic Jewish movement of the early 1900s and the 1970s. Messianic Judaism would not have developed apart from the Hebrew Christian movement of the 19th century. And the Hebrew Christian movement would not have emerged if the Jewish missions movement had not brought it into existence. Therefore, I am grateful for all of these historical developments, and I see the hand of divine providence in their coming to be. Nevertheless, as one living after the Shoah, after Nostra Aetate, the Vatican Decree of 1965, after Pope John Paul II's visit to the Rome Synagogue and the Western Wall, and after the recent flowering of post-supersessionist Nicene Christian theology and exegesis, I find the contemporary expression of the missions, evangelistic missions to the Jewish people, to be, at best, counterproductive. I cannot look at missionary Jewish Christianity and missionary Messianic Judaism today without seeing them as, at best, seedbeds for post-missionary Messianic Judaism and perhaps post-missionary Jewish Christianity. And at worst, anachronisms deserving a respectful burial. Enough for post-missionary Messianic Judaism. I want to come back now to the discussion of ecclesiology and the role of post-missionary Messianic Judaism within the framework of the life of the church and the people of God. In PMJ, I argue that post-missionary Messianic Judaism implies a particular post-supersessionist Nicene ecclesiology. The phrase employed in PMJ to refer to this understanding of the church is bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel. Bilateral ecclesiology portrays the ecclesia as having a twofold constitution. It is a communion of Jews and Gentiles in the Messiah. This is in keeping with the bold claim of the Jewish Archbishop of Paris, Cardinal Lustiger of blessed memory, who asserted that the communion of Jew and Gentile is the primary original meaning of the word Catholic as a mark of the church. That was a bold statement. It is also in keeping with the 2015 document entitled "The Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable," composed by the Vatican Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. Paragraph 43 of that document begins with this extraordinary statement. I think it's actually, this sentence is worth memorizing. Quote, "It is and remains a qualitative definition of the Church of the New Covenant that it consists of Jews and Gentiles." It's the first half of the sentence. A qualitative definition of the Church of the New Covenant that it consists of Jews and Gentiles, even if the quantitative proportions of Jewish and Gentile Christians may initially give a different impression. I think that's just one of the most extraordinary statements I've ever read in a church document. According to the argument of PMJ, however, bilateral ecclesiology requires something beyond merely a fraternal relationship of individual Jews and Gentiles in the body of Christ. If Jewish identity is in such a context, is to attain visible expression and endure across generations, as it must if the communion of Jews and Gentiles in the ecclesia is truly a qualitative definition of the Church of the New Covenant, then Jewish life within the ecclesia must take corporate and institutional form, or forms. The ecclesia needs more than individual Jews. She needs an ecclesia ex circumcisione to partner with the ecclesia ex gentibus. She needs either a Jewish Christian church functioning as a Jewish expression of the Christian tradition, or a Messianic Jewish community functioning as a Jesus-confessing expression of the Jewish tradition. Or perhaps She needs both. Adherents of the Gentile Christian Torah movement reject bilateral ecclesiology. They do so for two reasons. First, they deny the fundamental premise that Jewish and Gentile identity remain distinct in the ecclesia, with each requiring visible expression. For them, there is one Torah applying in the same way to all without distinction. In a sense, all Gentiles who enter this sphere become Jews and are expected to follow all of the commandments. Second, since all Christian church traditions have rejected this view of the Torah, which these people advocate, they are all rendered illegitimate. Thus, adherents of the Christian Torah movement tend to view all historical institutional forms of Christianity as perversions of the gospel. In contrast, bilateral ecclesiology implies the recognition of Christian tradition as a flawed yet valid expression of the risen Messiah's presence in the world. The second half of the phrase denoting the ecclesiological proposal of PMJ adds the crucial post-missionary dimension, namely in solidarity with Israel. This implies that the bilateral ecclesia recognizes that she is not self-sufficient, but depends upon the life of the Jewish people for the Israelite identity that is intrinsic to her ecclesial identity. As already stated, her Jewish ecclesial expression, namely the Messianic Jewish expression of the ecclesia, is not a substitute for the Jewish people, but merely its sign and representative. This is why the ecclesia ex gentibus needs the ecclesia ex circumcisione, or at least a segment of the ecclesia ex circumcisione, to live as fully as possible within the orbit of the Jewish world. Adherents of missionary Jewish Christianity and missionary Messianic Judaism reject solidarity with Israel construed in this way. For missionary Jewish Christians, there may be some sense in which the church needs the Jewish people, but it cannot be compared to the way the Jewish people needs the church, or at least needs true Christianity. For missionary Messianic Jews, something similar is true. Israel's need for Jesus cannot be compared to the church's need for Israel. In contrast, the parity between these two needs is fundamental to bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel and to the overall message of PMJ. Bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel presents an ecumenical vision which honors the history and forms of both the Jewish people and the Christian churches, with one critical caveat. This ecclesiology challenges Jewish and Christian identity-forming traditions in those instances where each community constructed negative boundaries for the purpose of excluding the other. This ecumenical vision gives greater weight to the identity-forming core affirmations of the Jewish and Christian traditions. and based on those affirmations, treats their identity-forming negations as aberrations. This important point requires further elaboration. The Jewish people and the Christian church have each founded their communal existence on core affirmations. For the Jewish people, the core affirmation centers on God's loving election of Israel as a holy nation, distinct from all the peoples of the earth, and the expression of that covenant election in a way of life rooted in the Torah. For the church, on the other hand, the core affirmation centers on the death, resurrection, and second coming of the divine human Jesus and her own union with him as his body. Bilateral ecclesiology in solidarity with Israel assents to both sets of affirmations, those of the Jewish people and of the church, and thereby honors both traditions. However, the Jewish people and the church were each dissatisfied with the overlapping boundaries that these core affirmations permitted, and which their interdependent identities in reality required. Therefore, they each constructed artificial negative boundaries consisting of the denial of what the other affirmed. From that point on, one could not affirm Israel's loving election and covenantal life and be a member of the church in good standing. With perfect symmetry, from that point on, one could also not affirm the divine human mediation of Jesus the Messiah and be a member of the Jewish people in good standing. And so, what the position we take is to affirm both of these traditions in their affirmations and to negate these traditions in their negations. Post-missionary Messianic Judaism is the ecclesiological hinge linking the bilateral ecclesia to the Jewish people and tradition. Perhaps it might someday be joined by a post-missionary Jewish Christianity, which would expand and enrich the life of the ecclesia ex circumcisione. A post-missionary Jewish Christianity could establish a second hinge, solidifying the Catholicity of the bilateral ecclesia by connecting the ecclesia ex circumcisione to the ecclesia ex gentibus in an even more organic union. And now, my conclusion. The post-missionary Messianic Jewish vocation constructs Messianic Jewish identity as subordinate to the aim of recovering the wholeness of the twofold people of God. That identity involves seeing what most others do not see. Jesus and his body amid Jewish life, Israel in the life of the church, and bearing visible witness to that vision. Given the tragic history of Christian hatred for Jews and Judaism, such witness is most fittingly born not through proclamation which draws attention to itself, but through a servant-oriented way of life which demonstrates joint commitment to Jesus and the Jewish people. Post-missionary Messianic Judaism is about solidarity with the Jewish people and solidarity with the church. with the goal of bringing closer the day when each will show solidarity with the other. Nicaea might also be understood as a story of God's solidarity with human beings and with the entire creative order. Sadly, according to Christian memory, Nicaea was also a turning point in the dividing of the twofold people of God, authorizing the rejection of any Christian dependence on Jewish calendrical reckoning, namely the date of Easter. Post-missionary Messianic Jews are called to imitate the divine self-emptying received as part of the Christological heritage of Nicaea, so as to contribute to the repair of the schism symbolized by Nicaea's calendrical heritage. The task of post-missionary Messianic Jews is not prophetic denunciation or evangelistic proclamation. Our task is to bear witness through a way of life in which Jesus becomes visible in the heart of Judaism, and the people ever cherished by the Messiah become visible in the heart of the church. As the God of Israel has shown solidarity with us all in Jesus, I, perhaps quixotically, believe that he will make a way for us post-missionary Messianic Jews to fulfill our task. And if we fail, as we might, God will accomplish the goal in another way. In any case, as our rabbi taught, nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known. Thank you.